Pat, Rory, thank you both very much indeed for joining us this week. It's Wednesday. We've just heard from Tony Blair, and he talked about that exit poll being a lightning moment, an illuminating bright light moment. Where were you and what did you feel in that lightning moment? Rory?
So I was sitting in the back of a taxi cab on my way to go on at Channel 4 to do this election night commentary. And I'd just come from an event where the rumours were all that Boris might have been in danger of losing his seat and that the Conservatives were going to not get an overall majority. And this was, serious political commentators and people.
Name them, I say.
Exactly. and then suddenly that. And it was extraordinary because I had obviously believed very, very strongly that the way to win elections was in the centre ground and that this was a bad mistake. I felt, in fact, that there was no way that traditional Labour seats were going to vote for Boris, and I also felt that you were digging in ever shallower waters on the kind of Brexit right, and that by neglecting the centre, it was very difficult to win.
Well, we'll explore a bit more of that. Pat, where were you and what did you feel in that illuminating moment?
I was at home in my constituency in Wolverhampton with my wife, and we watched it, and they have the little clock on the screen counting down, 2 minutes, 1 minute, and so on. And it's right, it was a moment of brutal clarity. I think it had been coming for some time. I was less surprised than Rory by what it showed.
You were expecting the phrase Conservative majority.
Yeah.
The numbers you were expecting?
The numbers you can come and go with a bit, but I thought Labour was making an enormous mistake of the Labour leadership in agreeing to a Get Brexit Done election according to really a campaign grid that
someone else had
Boris Johnson
for their own benefit.
Number 10 had been pushing for some months, and most Labour MPs felt like that. And I just think it was fighting on the worst possible grounds for that. Now, there are other things we'll come on to talk about, because I don't think Brexit was the only issue for Labour at this election. I think there was a massive Jeremy Corbyn and Corbynism issue, which among Labour voters, I think, outweighed the Brexit effect. But I think both of those were big, powerful things in driving our...
What was your doorstep experience when you knocked on doors? What kind of stuff? Jeremy Corbyn was treated to a lot of anecdotes about this at the Parliamentary Labour Party meeting last night. What was your experience on the doorstep in terms of what really came up, what moved voters?
My overwhelming impression among voters on the doorstep was that although there was a lot of Brexit frustration, and the phrase Get Brexit Done was effective in saying there's a way through this frustration, the bigger factor that people mentioned to me as a reason for not voting Labour was Jeremy Corbyn and Corbynism. And what do I mean by Corbynism? I mean, in particular, his view of the world, which I think put Labour on the wrong side of patriotism. And if you're aspiring to be the leader of a country, and people don't really think you believe in that country, that you're not really for that country, that's a disqualification for office from
But this is the thing Jeremy Corbyn, a lot of them voted for in 2017.
Yeah,
what changed?
I think their mood, their view of him had set in a very different way. He got the benefit of the doubt in 2017. We heard some of this in working class seats in 2017, and remember, even in 2017 there was 130 seats, I think, which had a swing from Labour to Conservatives, while the national result was swinging slightly the other way. So some of this effect was still there.
But we had more talk in 2017, didn't we, about Hamas and the IRA. The newspapers were putting it on their front pages. It was getting picked up more. We didn't get as much of that this time.
Well, I actually thought in 2017, I'm not sure that I agree with that.
You think there was more this time?
I think it really settled with the voters, this view of the world. And maybe we can come back to that in terms of its cultural impact on the Labour Party, which I think has been very negative. And the other big thing was, I think our manifesto was, instead of inspiring was just too much. People were alarmed by it. They didn't know how these things were going to be paid for. I think both the policy prescription and the person were big negative impacts on the vote. So ultimately we had the wrong person and the wrong programme.
Does the Labour Party look finished to you, Rory Stewart?
I mean, there is something a bit mysterious about this. It's very difficult. I mean, Pat's very close to this, but I think it's very easy for us straight after an event like this to apply theories to it, and it's quite difficult to work out scientifically how you would judge what the problems were, how much of this was about Jeremy Corbyn, how much about Boris, how much about policies, how much about Brexit. I mean, there was a lot in the Labour Manifesto which was, of course, deeply impressive in the sense that they'd put a lot of thought into it. There was an enormous amount of detail into it. They'd clearly had some incredibly smart, dedicated people working their way through this. By comparison, the Conservative Manifesto was quite light on that kind of detail and content.
Deliberately so, I think, was it? Maybe minimise the target.
Yeah, but Pat's probably right that maybe the sense is that politics, particularly at the moment, feels like a more sort of broad brush, gut instinct. It doesn't particularly matter on the details of your manifesto. It's the sense of
whose side you're on, is it?
Yeah, or whether or not you're going to be able to really deliver it. I mean, I guess with what I find with a lot of people that I talk to, that they necessarily disagreed with what Jeremy Corbyn said he wanted to do. It was they weren't sure that he was ever really going to be able to do it. And somehow, ironically, with Boris, although the detail was much skimpier, he'd somehow managed, partly through these things that I really hated, his brutal behaviour in proroguing Parliament, and the confrontation of Supreme Courts, and all this kind of stuff, to develop a bit of a reputation as somebody who was going to bulldoze his way through things, which I think was probably quite useful to him when it came to.
Do you think the next Labour leader, Pat McFadden, has a ghost of a chance of being Prime Minister? Or we're actually looking at the election of an interim figure, a transitional figure, a Kinnock figure, at best, from your perspective?
I think anything is possible. I mean, we are sort of on the floor now after this result, the worst result since 1935, and it's easy to conclude in a sort of emotional state after that, oh my God, we'll never win for however many years or maybe ever, and so on. I think that would be a mistake. Anything's possible, and if you look at how politics has changed in the last 5 years, a lot can change, but the only thing worse than a defeat of the magnitude and scale that we got last week would be the refusal to learn from it. And I think when I look back to the only other defeat I can compare with this is 1983, when Labour got a similar number of seats, in fact slightly more. At least in 1983, there was a broad acceptance that this wasn't just Michael Foot's fault, it was the whole outlook, approach, philosophy that had to change.
Do you see that now?
And that process, well, I'm coming to that, that process began with Neil Kinnock, culminated in Tony Blair, and all that hard work and the hard yards put into that. I'm not sure I do see that now. And I think there are worrying signs of denial. There's outright denial in terms of the we'll blame the media, or we'll blame it all on Brexit, or the most useless one of all, we won the argument. I mean, and I think that's all denial. But I also think there's another kind of easy reaction, which I think would duck the challenge, which is a sort of split the difference. We'll neither be Corbynistas, nor will we be, well, we don't want to go too far. And I think you've got to not think about it as a linear thing. I think 3 big things have to change for Labour. One is the view of the world, and this where you are in relation to the country, which Jeremy Corbyn's completely on the wrong side of. The second, as I say, is this economic offer. And Rory talked about, well, some elements of this are maybe good ideas and popular. Of course, Labour should always be in the position, I think, of saying we want good public services. We want to be on the side of people who can't buy their way out of situations. So good education, good public protection, good NHS and so on. And if we have to raise a bit more money to do that, we should always be in that position. But people expect it to be part of a credible programme. They also want it to be future-looking. When I look at Labour's moments of victory in the past, and there have been far too few of them, 45, 64, 97, they were always about promising a better tomorrow, not promising a better yesterday. And I think, as well as the scale of what we were offering, the direction of it, defining radicalism as unwinding change that has happened over the last 30 or 40 years, also has to be questioned, because in a world where perhaps the challenge is, if you know, the Googles, the Starbucks, the Amazons, getting these big companies to pay their way, is the definition of radicalism really unwinding change? And if I may, the third thing that has to change in the Labour Party is the culture. It's become awfully factional, sectarian, this culture of the sect. And so we've got to change all of that. It's got to be a much more welcoming place than it has been in recent years.
So, I mean, Pat, I think, has put his finger on one of the real vulnerabilities of Jeremy Corbyn, which was in the days when I'm now, as an independent, looking at this in a slightly, I hope, a slightly more objective way, but the days when I was campaigning against Jeremy Corbyn, it was much too easy to say, look, in the end, this guy is sort of back to the future. His vision of the sunlit uplands is really the 1970s, and he doesn't have anything to say about AI, he doesn't have anything to say about robotics, he doesn't have anything to say about the future shape of work. So I think Pat is absolutely right that for the Labour Party to come through, particularly when the Conservative Party also had a slightly nostalgic offer. I mean, Brexit was a strong element of nostalgia to it. To become the party that sounds like it's defining the future, has grasped where Britain could be in 20 years' time, is incredibly important.
But you've got the new infusion of membership that came with Jeremy Corbyn, thanks to Ed Miliband's rule change, some of it. That doesn't look like a constituency base for the leadership contest that's going to elect anyone who's not in his image or doesn't have his blessing, does it? Or have we misjudged that?
Well, we'll see. I'm not.
Do you think the scales have fallen from some people's eyes, as you would see it?
I don't know. I'm not going to claim to be able to look inside the minds of all the Labour Party members, and I really feel for them as well. Look, at the people I think we principally let down are the public when we offer an unelectable leader and a programme that is incredible and a worldview and all the things I've said. So the principal letdown is for the public, but I actually think we also let our members down. I mean, so to me, it's not just about whether how much they love Jeremy Corbyn. It's asking the question, remember that taste of defeat. This is what I said to some of my people at the Count. So remember how this feels, losing like this, and use that feeling in the future to drive forward the changes necessary. Because if you don't do that, if you don't absorb and remember the bitter taste of defeat, I'm afraid you are fated to repeat it.
What's the
and that
answer?
Would be a tragedy both for our members and for the public.
In terms of the leadership contest, what's the answer? I'm putting you down as a Rebecca Long-Bailey doubtful.
Well, I think any continuity Corbynism would be a failure to learn the lessons.
But listening to what you said a second ago about those people who are trying to sort of split the difference, that's been an accusation levelled at Keir Starmer, who this morning is saying, manifesto, good, leader may be wrong, I paraphrase, but he's not on your list either, is he?
Look, I'm less focused at the moment on the person. I know
but I'm trying to tempt you a little.
Journalists always want to know
it's
the
quite
person.
an important.
What I want to, of course it's important, and ultimately you need a person, you need a leader. But what I'm trying to say is if any of the putative candidates, and they may or may not come to me asking for a nomination or an endorsement, I'll be asking them, do you appreciate the extent of change needed here? Because I think if you think you can carry on with the same programme and outlook with a different face and voice, we'll simply be proving that we haven't learned. And when we do that, we fail in the founding purpose of the Labour Party, because it's not perpetually to come second in a two-horse race. And when we keep losing, as we did this time, it's not our manifesto that gets implemented, it's the Conservative manifesto.
Let's talk about that. Rory, you touched on there how you thought politics was one in the centre, and that exit poll moment sort of left you a bit winded. Yeah. Isn't it possible that Boris Johnson has rediscovered that the centre has moved, and actually there's a sort of right-wing Blairism that you can do, where you can't be outflanked on the right on immigration or law and order, but you are splashing a bit more money around than the Tories used to do on public services. Isn't it possible you misjudged where the centre was?
Well, that isn't the centre. I mean, a more authoritarian, anti-immigration, hard Brexit line with a bit more public spending isn't the centre. Any number of right-wing governments have spent money. And there's a sort of misunderstanding in British politics. They imagine that because you're splashing some money around, that somehow means that you're left-wing. I mean, it's, Vladimir Putin spends quite a lot of money on things. So
but it might be as left-wing as people want.
Well, look, he got a great victory, right? And it was a remarkable thing. And he did it through an enormous amount of clarity. I would also say, wouldn't I, that he did it against a very, very unusual opponent. So we don't actually know. And actually, even the Lib Dems didn't present a centrist picture. The Lib Dems decided to run on an extraordinary extreme Brexit position and a very, very strange...
So his type of conservatism hasn't been stress tested as it might have been, you'd say?
Yeah, I don't know what would have happened had he been running against a more centrist vision. I mean, certainly when I was running against him in the leadership, there were times when I was out polling him amongst the general public. I mean, I think if you look at the public as a whole, I felt that many... I mean, and then this is the danger of this thing. He will understandably think this is a great vindication of his entire style of politics.
But do you think it's a reluctant majority in some ways?
I mean, a lot of people will have felt they were faced with some pretty bad options here, and that he was the least bad option. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're endorsing the full style of that type of politics. I think many people feel like me that, liberal values, respect for the Constitution, for the courts, for Parliament, these things are very important. And I think that reason and detail in politics is very important, and that we shouldn't have governments that get away with these very kind of broad brush, slightly empty slogans. It's brilliant that you have something called Get Brexit Done that the other side can't get, but what is this thing? Right?
Well, it's an interesting tension, isn't there? Going to be. You've had to watch a few Tory governments, perhaps more than you would have liked. And Rory, you've watched them from the Tory benches most of your time. There's this tension, isn't there, potentially, between what we understand to be the sort of Dominic Cummings way of going about things, which is to break lots of furniture and see what happens next, and what Boris Johnson has traditionally said he wants, which is to be a sort of Heseltine liberal conservative and all the rest of it. Do you think that lots of people are scratching their heads and wondering whether it's on Brexit or on social policy or anything. We could see Boris Johnson tack towards the centre, or do you think that is just impossible with this election mandate, with what he's already committed to doing and has said to get the job?
Well, I think he's somebody who is comfortable with some aspects of modern Britain, definitely. But I also think that he's somebody who will have concluded that he won, and he won big on a particular strategy, which was appealing to a particular voter group, particularly in the Midlands and the North East. And he will want to keep hammering that drum and keeping those voters with him and keeping those MPs. And remember, a lot of these new MPs that he's brought in are speaking for those constituencies.
And that makes him more hard line from your perspective.
I think, let's take something that people haven't talked about much in this, which is criminal justice. One of the great tests of a Tory government. Somebody like Ken Clarke, David Gauke, tends to be on the Liberal side. Right? They tend to...
rehabilitation of prisoners.
Rehabilitation of offenders, challenging unnecessary short sentences, trying to think about public protection, not overcrowding the prisons. Right? That's a really good test for us. What's he actually doing on that? He's concluded that people want, effectively, prison sentences doubled, a very radical increase, therefore, in the prison population that would come out of that. That would mean prison population itself would come close to doubling. So why is he saying that? He's saying that because I think Dominic Cummings has told him that part of the public, and a lot of them traditional Labour voters, who are not London voters, want to see him showing that he's tough on crime. So, and the second thing that isn't of the centre is that I think, where Pat and I think agree strongly, is an idea of fiscal responsibility, which is that we have an obligation to future generations, that you need to work out how you do things to create the conditions for people today to flourish, but you also have to think about people in the future. And I think one of the very sad things about this campaign was that lack of fiscal responsibility. I don't know what's going to happen to our deficit and debt now.
Pat, he's talking there about, there's a conundrum here that people won't scratch their heads about a bit, that Boris Johnson is going to be more right-wing because he's pandering to the people who used to vote for you.
Well, I think on the Labour side, we need to be a bit wary of laziness in how we criticise Tory governments. I think there's a temptation always to think that we're facing the party of Margaret Thatcher and we'll talk about cuts and austerity and so on, and I think Boris Johnson will mark a change from that. There certainly have been a lot of cuts in recent years, and in a place like Wolverhampton, which I represent, you can feel that in the public domain, and what the council's able to do or not do for people, and extra charges for things, and people's incomes and so on. And people have been through a tough economic time in the last 10 years, which has added to public anger and discontent. But I think he will turn the spending taps on. I think having won a lot of these seats in the North and the Midlands, there's every indication that he's going to try and pump a lot of money into them. I don't know who Boris Johnson's Chancellor is going to be, but that's going to be that person's job, is to find the resources for that. So I think no matter what else happens on the Labour side, we need to update in a new context how we think and talk about the Conservative Party, because it would be a mistake to think that we were in the same place as we were 20 years ago with Tony Blair or 30, 40 years ago with Margaret Thatcher. This is a new situation, both in England and in Scotland.
Can we just touch, because we mentioned Brexit briefly, we might come back to it, but something that both of you are very passionate about is the union of the United Kingdom. And I just wonder if it wasn't your first thought when you saw that flashing sign with the exit poll, maybe it was your second or third when you saw the actual numbers and the SNP numbers. What do you think is
I think this is
coming down the tracks?
I think this is one of the biggest differences from, say, 20 years ago. We now have potentially competing nationalisms in Scotland and England. The SNP very dominant in Scotland now, and you might conclude there that the identity power of nationalism has overcome the traditional factors that made Scotland return 40 Labour MPs or thereabouts time after time in previous elections. In England, if the Conservative Party has turned into quite an English nationalist party, question what will that impact be on voter identities in the future. So that's one potential impact of these competing nationalisms. But the other one, of course, is on the UK itself. And speaking from a Labour point of view, commitment to the UK, to keeping the UK together, is something that is very strong and that has stayed, whatever else other changes have been made on our side in recent years. And I think the UK is going to be put to the test here, because I can see competing nationalisms putting under great strain.
One of the issues with this type of nationalist discourse is, again, it gets away from anybody taking responsibility for running things well. So classically with the SNP, the reason it's so frustrating running against them is you can't actually hold them responsible. They may be responsible for health in Scotland, but nobody really votes on that basis, even when health is performing badly in Scotland, right? They're perpetually shifting the conversation onto Scottish independence in the same way as the Conservative Party is tempted now to shift the conversation onto this rather abstract idea of Brexit. And actually, I feel, this is true in politics in general. It's very, very difficult, whether you're talking about a mayor in a city or a member of parliament or a party, to ever pin these people down and say, what are you actually responsible for? How am I supposed to judge you? What kind of results are you responsible for? Because everybody is sort of very, very adept. The SNP very adept, for example, saying it's not our fault, it's the fault of the central government. Mayors will say the same. I mean, it's a general slopey shouldered shifting of responsibility, and for some reason voters are letting politicians get away with it. So I don't know how we can. A real democracy needs to have a sense, this is what you're responsible for, right? So I can ask very simple questions. Are these things improving or not? And if not, I'm going to boot you out.
Do you think it was almost as if, on that point, before we go back to Scotland, that Get Brexit Done was the first time they'd seen a slogan that might actually be delivered, albeit it won't be got off the telly because it'll go on forever and ever in the negotiations potentially. But that was what I found talking to voters in marginal seats. That came up again and again. At least we know there's one thing we'll get.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I mean, I think the interesting thing about it is that although the nature of this Brexit is completely undefined, and we won't know for months what it's actually going to feel like, the voters were right in saying that this is a relatively simple thing. If this guy gets a majority, he can, on the 31st of January, leave the European Union. And it's very rare in politics to have something of that sort. I mean, if you campaign, for example, on making streets safer, it's much more difficult for the public to evaluate that, know whether you're going to do it or not. They knew that if they gave this guy a majority, he would at least be able to leave the European Union.
Just before we leave Scotland, though, as it were, do you think Brexit happening at the end of January is going to mean that a lot of Scottish people actually don't desperately want a referendum, even if they give the SNP a majority in 2021, and that they want to see how it all settles, or that it will crystallise feelings and actually the feelings for independence could go over the 50% mark?
Hugely dangerous. I think the Union is now more important than Brexit in being the defining question of the next 5 years. I mean, making the arguments again for the United Kingdom is so urgent, so pressing, felt so deeply now. And the SNP had a remarkable result, given that they are, in some ways, a relatively tired government that hasn't actually been delivering a lot of the things.
But does Brexit play into the anxiety about independence, or does it actually boost it?
It boosts it because I think that in the end, the clever thing about all nationalisms is that they are acts of faith. They have very little relationship to economic realities. We were very lucky, in a sense, people like Pat and myself who believe in the United Kingdom were lucky that that last referendum was won. And I think that the people, the Better Together campaign, who thought that the way to win it was to focus on, hard economic facts, were wrong. Absolutely wrong. You can't defeat nationalism any more than you can defeat Brexit by making arguments about macroeconomics. You have to make arguments about emotion.
What do you think, Pat?
Someone who was quite senior in the campaign to keep the UK together in the Scottish referendum a few years ago said to me it was a bit like Braveheart versus KPMG.
Right. Right.
In terms of countering the emotional appeal of nationalism with talking about GDP and your income and all the rest of it. And the Brexit referendum was a bit like that as well, and I think that is a big lesson in modern politics, which hasn't been fully thought through by those who are not nationalists, those who want to keep these unions together, or if they can't be kept together, at least to keep close relationships between them. There is, of course, a flawed logic in the Scottish answer to Brexit being to break another union with the UK, but that may not be how it's thought about. And one of the things I'm really concerned about for the next 5 years is the impact of these two competing Scottish and English nationalisms pulling at a union which, just survived the referendum experience back in 2014.
Rory, you're planning to run for mayor as an independent. Isn't one of the lessons looking at the last election that leaving the two big motherships doesn't bring immense good political fortune?
So I believe that London and cities is the place where independents actually do have a chance. I think in national politics, people are understandably very sceptical because, with the best one in the world, an independent MP is like a sort of Martin Bell figure, a nice guy in a white suit on a backbench who doesn't have much.
There are more contemporary examples, your old mates, like David Gauke. But
the reason they didn't get in is that people perceive that were they to get in, they would be these ineffectual solitary figures on the backbenches. A mayoral race is different. If you're lucky enough to be elected, you are the chief executive of the city. I also think that actually cities are where the future of politics lies. I think people are very suspicious of legislators. They don't really understand, I felt anyway, in my seat, People didn't fully understand what a Member of Parliament was. They wanted me to deal with local issues. They didn't want me to be sitting in Parliament voting and stuff. They liked that intimate, immediate connection.
Is this the beginning of a new political movement, your
I
campaign as an independent?
I hope so. I think these...
A new centre party of some kind?
I think these parties are... I'm very suspicious of the idea of parties or politics in general at the moment. I think actually the mechanisms of these things are very, very weird. They're taken hostage generally by members who are not representative of the general population. Their whipping systems are odd. Their manifestos are odd. They spend their whole time apologising for their leaders.
Do you think we could be surprised the new centre party could form in what you probably think is a vacuum at the moment in the middle of politics?
Huge, gaping desire for this. And I think it is partly that the public sense that they don't like divided politics. They're fed up with the rhetoric which Conservatives throw at Labour, and Labour at the Conservatives this idea of portraying the other side as somehow evil scum, which you heard again and again all the way through the campaign, that actually, of course, the truth is we have far more in common as humans than we want to acknowledge. And I think the second most important thing is that there is a huge hole for a different analysis of our economy in our country, a completely different theory of our economy, which neither the Conservatives nor Labour are putting forward.
Pat, you'd agree with bits of that, even if you don't want to see a centre party right now and you want to take back the Labour Party?
Well, they talk about broad churches, don't they? And I feel that the tradition that has been in charge of the Labour Party in recent years has really put that under strain, as I say, for some of the reasons we talked about earlier, this view of the world, which is very anti-Western and all of that. So the question for me is, does the Labour Party have the capacity to change from that now, going back to the defeat, and to embark on a direction and a tradition I would more recognise? That's an open question. I don't know, but I think that's the challenge.
And if they don't, chances of a new force forming in politics. We saw a couple of planes not get off the runway very well just before the election, but it could be a reality in this next Parliament.
Oh,
perhaps.
who knows? Look, the example of the Tiggers, as we call them, it just didn't work for them. If you look at the Lib Dems, they haven't managed to...
But some of your old friends and colleagues there, people who you see the world a lot the same as, went into those two projects. Yes. I mean, it's not unthinkable, is it, that if someone in Jeremy Corbyn's image took over the leadership of the Labour Party, a great big ice shelf of Labour MPs and Labour supporters could break off?
Well,
is it?
You know, I don't know. I'm not going to predict the future, but I just, this is maybe we it's weighed down a bit by history. I mean, even the SDP and the Liberals together, when they were the Alliance in the mid-1980s, the circumstances for a centre third-party breakthrough at that time were probably as good as you can think of in the post-war era. You had Thatcherism on one side and you had Michael Foot on the other, and they couldn't break through. So the historical precedents for this are, they suggest, they emphasise the difficulty of it. Now, maybe the past doesn't predict the future.
Tony Blair this morning was saying that if it hadn't been for Kinnock coming in...
Well, that's the point I'm making. I'm making the same point.
But you are saying, go for Rebecca Long-Bailey and you'll get a centre party.
We now have a chance, in my plea, warning, whatever you want to call it, to the Labour Party, is, for goodness sake, we have to change direction. Not because I want to win some internal argument with people that are Corbynistas and so on. That's not what it's about. It's about, what are you for? And if your founding purpose 100 years ago was to win in order to enact change and all the things that we're proud of, from the Good Friday Agreement to the minimum wage to the NHS, are based on the hard yards of building a winning coalition. If all you're for is electing somebody who makes you feel comfortable, makes you feel good rather than your ability to do good by winning, then you're letting the public down, and you're letting down all those members who walked with me and other candidates in recent weeks to deliver leaflets and knock doors for a cause that fell down to a disastrous defeat.
Thank you for your festival of ideas, and thank you for taking part in what has undoubtedly been a seasonal fun-packed Christmas edition of the podcast with just a slight whiff of the funeral parlour. Thank you both very much indeed.